topics in non-market decision-making, some interesting things, and then we'll go on to do the review for the final. Now, if this ever turns on. Okay, so for this non-market decision-making stuff, we're going to take the tools of economics and we're going to extend it to analyze people operating, like how they make decisions in non-market settings. So we'll be using things like methodological individualism, seeing people as rational actors, using their economizing behavior and understanding the incentives they face in order to see why they reach these decisions and why they engage in these practices that we may think are very weird. So some beliefs, they may seem like odd superstitions, but they're really rational responses to problems that are faced by societies. Remember, economics requires the assumption of rationality. So if we see these really weird things going on, it's helpful to understand really why these are happening, if we really think people are rational. If not, and these show that people are rational, then we really have to go back to the drawing board if we're trying to talk about economics. So what today is kind of like an exercise in breaking down these practices, trying to understand why they exist and how they exist using the tools of economics. So the first thing I want to talk about is gypsy law. Have you guys seen that show, like My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding? Or TLC had a couple of shows a couple years ago, like talking about gypsies. I thought it was like a joke that they didn't really exist anymore, but these societies still do exist. They're like in the United States, Canada, and like all across Europe. So gypsies are nomadic people, but they can't use government or simple ostracism to produce social order. So if we have a problem with people acting in ways that harm society, in antisocial ways, we have laws, so we can go to the government. We can sue them in court. There's other societies, maybe they work in imagine like a small town, that they can ostracize people that are acting antisocial, that are doing things to harm other members of the community. Gypsies can't do that because they go in small groups and they move around all the time. Gypsy law is grounded in unusual superstitions that are very odd and uncommon for us. They see unguarded contact with the lower half of the human body as ritually polluting, and ritual defilement is physically contagious. So then if you've polluted yourself, dealing with other people makes them polluted as well. And non-gypsies, people like us, are in an extreme state of defilement because we don't follow gypsy law. So the law itself is called Romania, which is it's like a form of customs that built up over time, and it's passed on orally. So there's two concepts that we're going to talk about: ritual pollution, which is marim, and vujo, which is ritual cleanliness. The gypsies believe that the body is unclean, or marim, below the waist. So everything, also they draw a line here, everything down there is dirty. Everything above here is clean. And the head they consider the cleanest or the purest. So unguarded contact, literally touching bare skin, with the unclean portion of the body makes that person marim, makes them ritualistically unclean. So these are some examples I took right from Pete Leeson's article about this. Because clothes touch the lower part of the body, they're considered dirty. So men's pants and women's skirts are considered marim. So if a woman walks in front of a seated man, such that her genital area passes in front of his head, that's enough to pollute that man, even if she's fully clothed. And if a woman walks on the floor above a man as he's in a room, that makes him marim as well. When preparing food, women must wear aprons. If men are working with food, they have to as well. This blocks women's skirts or the men's pants from polluting the food and making it dirty. If it is dirty, they have to throw the food out and start cooking all over again. Naturally, sex is going to be very very difficult for gypsies because of their cleanliness rules, because it involves physical contact between the bodies. So they only allow like the very like basic types of sex, only within marriages. They have certain rituals about how to like begin, how to undress to make sure that they don't like pollute each other. Hands are difficult for gypsies because they go between the upper and lower halves of the body, so they can literally like they can touch their legs, make themselves dirty that way. So they can't wash their hands in the same sinks as like dishes or eating utensils because their hands are dirty. That'll make the utensils dirty. They'll pollute the food and make them even dirtier. Gypsies can't use sponges or cloths that also clean their bodies to wash dishes or cutlery. Again, they can't make the utensils for eating dirty. And dishes or utensils that a person washes in the wrong sink or with the wrong cloth become marine, and they have to throw them out. They cannot use them anymore. Dogs and cats are considered dirty, as are all non-gypsies. So because we don't follow these laws, we're considered dirty. And by gypsy like dealing with us would pollute them, make them unclean. If a gypsy has to eat away from their home, if they have to eat with the, I don't know how to pronounce it, the gaje, people like us, they have to bring their own disposable cutlery that are clean. And they can't eat certain foods that have been prepared by us, again, being unclean. And they won't allow people like us into their living spaces. They have like, if they do tend to host people that are non-gypsies, they'll have like a special chair for them to sit in their house that they keep away and hidden that they won't sit in. And they'll allow them like in their front living room or like parlor, but they won't allow them like in the house like where they sleep or anything like that, or in their kitchen. Now, these laws seem really weird to us, right? And particularly onerous. Like, if you like cook food slightly wrong, if you like get it dirty, you have to throw it out and start over again. That's a big hassle. All the weird sexual practice they have is very costly, very annoying to have to deal with. But they do this for particular reasons that begin to make sense as we look at this more. So gypsies, when you look at how they organize their society, they can't rely on state institutions to enforce their contracts. A lot of the businesses they get into are either illegal, like across a lot of Europe, you're not allowed to like read fortunes and stuff like that. Also, when they get into businesses, they collude with each other. They openly collude, and they form like their own cartels, and they limit access to the industry, and they divvy up the areas that they're allowed to operate in, which legal courts in most countries will not, they won't enforce those contracts. Now, a way that some communities get around this, not being able to use like official state to enforce their social order, is to use ostracism. So literally not talking to an individual, shunning them if they're acting antisocially. They're doing, engaging in things that's making society worse off. No one wants the extra credit before the final exam? All right. But ostracism doesn't work for the gypsies because they're constantly moving, and they're in very small groups. Ostracism can only function when most of society can observe individuals easily, or they can communicate with each other. So imagine this whole class is like a small community. If we're together all the time, then it's easy to ostracize people. It's easy to see if they're doing something wrong that's like harmful, and it's easy to shun them. If like we normally are, everyone like goes their own way outside of class. You spend very little time together. It's difficult to see if someone is acting antisocially, and then it's difficult to communicate with everyone else in the class and then enforce it. Because you don't see what other people do, even though someone should be shunned, someone else in the class could be hanging out with them the whole time, and like no one sees that. It's the same thing for gypsies, that it's very easy, or it's very difficult for people to see if another gypsy is hanging out with someone who is considered dirty. So simple ostracism wouldn't just work. So what they do is they attach a superstition to this social order that they developed. So they turn these antisocial practices into things that are spiritually forbidden and that make them ritualistically dirty. So it includes both crimes against gypsies. So they're like breaking contracts. They're I don't know, like chiseling away at the cartel they formed, starting their own business, and then obviously things like killing a gypsy, stealing from them. They also include this unclean behavior, the ritualistically dirty kind of stuff, and kind of considers them all the same. They have this strict and unbending notion of purity, but this serves a purpose. Like they're very strict on this. They don't change the rules. They don't let people off the hook easily. These are very rigid and unchanging, and it seems very, I don't know, almost, I don't want to say uncaring, but it's very, very strict. But what this requires is a strong religious belief in the superstition, that these gypsies have to believe that this engaging in behavior that makes them Marim is going to seriously impact their, I don't know, their soul or their, I guess their soul. So when nearly all the population believes in this superstition, this becomes an effective mechanism to control people's behavior and to prevent them from acting antisocially. So now, the cost of adhering to the Romania is high. Obviously, it's very difficult. It can be very costly if you mess up and you have to throw out all the old food. One of the examples in the paper he writes is a bunch of gypsy women gathering, like picking berries. One of them had them in a bucket and stepped over them. They had to throw out all those berries because it became unclean. This kind of stuff screens out weak believers and forces them out of the community. So an example of this is if you listen to the gospel, or not the gospels, the letters from the apostles after the gospels. They talk a lot about lukewarm believers and hey, you can't have people that waver in the faith in the community. It's this sort of idea that weak believers negatively impact the community and they don't follow all the rules. So an example they give is there was several gypsy men getting into a brawl, and the wife didn't want her husband involved in that. So she ran out and shook her skirt. Imagine it's the 1800s, so it's the big puppy dresses. Shook it at them. Because if it touched them, the men would become Marim. They'd be unclean and they'd be kicked out of the gypsy group. They immediately stopped fighting to get back away from her husband. In their society, the gypsies are the first line of legal monitoring to see if individuals are breaking these laws or acting antisocially. So the lawbreaker believes in supernatural punishment, so they're going to do whatever they can to avoid acting in this way, to avoid these practices that are that negatively impact the gypsy society. If they do break a crime, they almost always remove themselves from the family in order to save their family, because it's contagious. Because the uncleanliness can transfer from people to people very easily by being around them. Once they break these laws, they remove themselves from their family. They go away. So they basically confess to the crimes. So they also mentioned that crimes that make one Marim are contagious, just like the ritual violations. So each gypsy has a strong incentive to know the history of each new person that joins them. Someone new shows up in the gypsy camp, they're going to look into them and try to figure out who they are before they allow them into the group and allow them to come with them. Because if they are dirty, that's going to make them dirty and get them kicked out of gypsy culture as well. And then the threat of declaring someone Marim makes them comply with what's called the Chris Council, or they have a large overseeing council for each area of elders that lay down these decisions. So if one gypsy feels they were cheated by another gypsy, they will go to that council, and the council will try to ascertain some facts and determine if that one individual wronged the other one, or if they were just, if the other didn't engage in the act, it was a false accusation, or if the person was just overreacting. If they say that person was acting wrong, they declare that individual dirty, and they're basically kicked out of gypsy society. And because it's contagious, the uncleanliness is contagious, the other gypsies have to comply with that, or else it'll make them dirty as well. And they have a strong disdain for the Gajikano, which is the name for the group of all non-gypsies. So the third punishment is severe because they have a strong hatred and dislike of the non-gypsy world. So being forced to live in it is a huge cost for them. So now, there's some characteristics of gypsy beliefs that show how this is more of a, these are beliefs to ensure that people don't engage in antisocial behavior. So first off, the Merim is only important for prime age individuals. So we're talking people from their teens till, I don't know, about retirement age, you can imagine. So the children and the elderly are excluded. They say children are pure because they don't know that much and they don't engage in truly bad actions. And then the elderly, it just sort of fades away for them. And this makes sense because 96% of crimes are committed by prime age adults. So what they're doing is only making this belief work for those people that are going to commit crimes, that are going to be likely to engage in these practices that they're trying to avoid. And they tie the concept, like I said, of spiritual purity and antisocial behavior together. So you have things like physical crime or like cheating other gypsies, going back on contracts, tied in with these religious things. They just combine them into one set of laws. And over the past 50 to 60 years, as the belief in these superstitions begin to diminish, as people nowadays, basically in most of the liberalized Western societies, we've seen a sharp decrease in religious attitudes, a lot less membership in churches. We're seeing the same thing in the gypsy community. And as their superstitions wane, the reliance on the Romania also wanes. So the belief in Merim has greatly diminished in the past 50 years. There's a lot of talk of the elder gypsies complaining that the young are not abiding by the Romania. The taboos are being ignored by the younger people in society, and the kris is very rarely used. In California, there's a decent-sized gypsy population there. They've been using civil courts to be able to handle a lot of their disputes. Obviously, not the ones that are involved in legal activity, but things that involve legal activity, they've been going through the courts. They developed some sort of deal with California where they would take a bunch of the decisions made by the kris in the past, and California, their courts would use those past rulings as precedent in deciding future gypsy cases. So what we're seeing is that the gypsies have these very odd beliefs and these very difficult practices to abide by. They have them for people that are going to commit crimes, and they do it in a way such that it forces them to admit their crimes and to remove them from society. Obviously, because the gypsies don't live in a tight-knit community altogether where they can observe each other, they're not going to be able to ostracize each other effectively. Because at any time, if you can't see what someone else is doing, they can do whatever they want. Think of it that way. So what they did in the past was they tied these sort of religious attitudes and the religious beliefs with their legal system. By putting them together into one, people were willing to give themselves up, and people were not willing to tolerate lawbreakers because they would negatively impact them, make them unclean, and hurt them in the long run. I mentioned that they strongly dislike the non-gypsy world. When gypsies are kicked out of their society, they have a high suicide rate, that they don't want to live with the unclean people that are not gypsies. I'm drawing a blank. There's that one movie, the one movie where they're in jail with Andy Dufresne. Shawshank Redemption. When that old guy lived in there for 40 years, he was in jail, suddenly he gets paroled at the end, and he doesn't fit in the outside world. He was very upset by that. He couldn't get a part of it, and he ends up killing himself in the movie. it's the same sort of thing with these gypsies. This world is so foreign to them, and it's something that they hate so much that they refuse to be a part of it. And it shows how strongly, or how this strong hatred helps keep them following these gypsy law and gypsy beliefs. And now gypsies, not only are they becoming less superstitious, but also they're a lot more, they settle a lot more than they did in the past. That they'll live in one area, so it's a lot easier for them to watch each other, to make sure they're not engaging in these social practices. And it's a lot easier to ostracize than it was in the past. So because of this, as we'd expect, the reliance on these beliefs and on these superstitions are beginning to completely fall away. Now that they have better alternatives, they're not engaging in these belief systems anymore. Now, does anyone have an idea why one of the major focuses they have is on sexual practices? Why these can be considered so weird? What purpose this serves? Thinking about how to, organize society and prevent antisocial behavior from occurring. So if it's pretty common knowledge, especially like among economists, that individuals raised by one parent tend to have a much more difficult time in life than having two parents, being raised in a two-parent household. They're more likely to commit crimes, and they're going to have lower average earnings in their lifetime. It's much more difficult to be raised that way. Now, in a lot of societies with government, just imagine the United States, we have social programs that seek to help out single-parent households. Because it's very difficult to both raise a child and then be able to make enough money to provide for it. But the gypsy culture, they're on their own, especially in the past. They didn't have these sorts of social welfare programs, things to be able to help out individuals raised in a single-family household. So one of the purposes of this was to try to prevent sex outside of marriage, to prevent children being raised in a single-family household, because of how difficult it would be, especially. They're not just living in one place, they're moving all around the country. So it makes it even more difficult. So purpose of some of those superstitions was to prevent children being born out of wedlock. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is ordeals. Ordeals were used in the legal system in Europe from the 1100s to the 1300s. And it was used in cases where there weren't clear evidence. If someone witnessed someone commit a murder, obviously that would be enough to solve the case. But in these cases, there was not clear evidence. One of the quotes I use is, "Let doubtful cases be determined by the judgment of God. The judges may decide that which they clearly know, but that which they cannot know shall be reserved for divine judgment." Now, in Europe in the Middle Ages, the religious and the legal political institutions were linked. They were completely joined together. Now these ordeals depended on a medieval superstition that was called Judicium Dei, which meant the judgment of God. And there were two types of ordeals that were primarily used. There was hot and cold ordeals. In hot ordeals, an individual plunged their arm into a boiling pot of water, and they had to pull out a stone or a ring. And then they were bandaged up, and 3 or 4 days later, the priest would examine it, and if their arm was all scarred up and boiled and stuff, they'd be considered guilty. And say God would have passed a judgment on them. But if they were innocent, they believed that God would have them pull out their arm unharmed, and they wouldn't have the scars and everything. Then there's cold ordeals, where an individual was bound up in rope, and they were thrown into cold water, and they either float or sank. So the problem with torture, torture has been used throughout time as a way to elicit confessions. However, you can get inconsistent, inaccurate results. If torture is strong enough to elicit a confession from someone who doesn't want to confess, it's also strong enough to get someone to confess that they didn't commit the crime. So you can get a lot of false positives. So ordeals was a practice that developed to help separate the guilty from the innocent. The goal was to get the guilty to confess or to deny the ordeal, and for the innocent to accept the ordeal. Obviously, if the guilty confesses, you don't have to, there's no fact-finding mission, there's no court case you need. If they deny the ordeal, it's pretty obvious that they're guilty. So there were different costs imposed on individuals that underwent the ordeal based off of their guilt. So if you're guilty, and we're assuming the belief in Iudicia Dei, if you're guilty, they believe that they're going to be harmed by the ordeal, that they're going to stick their arm in the boiling pot of water and they're going to have their arm all scarred up. Not only will that happen, but they're still going to be punished afterwards. Like, that's not their punishment. So it's less costly if you're guilty to just confess to the crime. You're still going to go to jail, but you're not going to have your arm all messed up. Now, if you're innocent, you will not be harmed because of God's intervention. So you're obviously going to take the ordeal. Again, this is if you believe in Iudicia Dei. And this belief was very persistent in medieval Europe. So at this time, from 9th to 13th century, people are going to take this ordeal. They're going to do that to prove their innocence. So it incentivizes the accused to reveal their criminal status to the legal system. They're going to admit that they're guilty so that they don't have to have their arm all messed up. So during the administration of ordeals, some people believe this is what's called iudicia cleri, which is it's not the will of God, it's the will of the priest. So the priest knew the local community members well. They knew if someone was bad, and they'd be someone who would commit crimes, or if they were a good person who was falsely accused, something got happened. When the belief in Iudicia Dei the belief in that is the sorting equilibrium. I think I missed some words when I copy and pasted this. So when the belief in Iudicia Dei is strong, the equilibrium is going to be that the innocent undergoes the ordeals and the guilty will not. Now the priest is able to fix the ordeal so that the innocent defendant is unharmed. Right here I have a long quote of how ordeals actually happened. So basically they would light a fire in the church and no one could enter the church once the fire was lit. Then a member of both sides, from the defendant and the prosecution, whatever, both sides, they would come in and stand on either side along the church. I remember churches are fairly big. You're not standing right next to the fire. You're way off to the side. So at the beginning of church, at the beginning of the mass that they would say, they would lay the iron on the hot coals until the very end of mass. So basically as long as they wanted to take. Then the accused would drink holy water, and then the hand would be sprinkled with holy water, and then he would go to the ordeal. This gave the priest a lot of room to stretch out mass, to say extra prayers, so the hot iron wasn't as hot, or so that the pot of boiling water, so that was allowed to simmer, to the temperature to go down. They could pour holy water all over their hand before they dipped it in, which would help them a little bit in the case. And then at the end, it was the priest who 3 days later looked at the hand and determined whether it was scarred or not. So even if it was somewhat damaged, they could still say, oh no, that's not damaged enough. The person's still innocent. And then just a note about Catholic doctrine, because of the belief in persona Christi, where the priest acts in the person of Christ, they're basically the vessel through which Christ acts, while they engage in certain sacraments. Even if this is the priest just saying, oh no, this person's innocent, and taking it easy on them, so to speak, it's not inconsistent with the belief in Iudicia Dei. So the priest and the proband, so the person that was being accused, were initially allowed in the church after the priest made the ordeal fire. No one else could see it. They couldn't mend the fire after communion. The ceremony required observers to line on the church's walls, so they're far off to the side. They can't see how much water the priest is putting on the individual's hands. So it could easily become a dousing under manipulate priest control if they really wanted to protect that individual, and then the priest determined whether it's harmed or unharmed. Now, that was for hot water ordeals, which was primarily used in Europe, but there were also cold water ordeals. Now, men have a lower body fat percentage than women, so an average lean male has an 80% chance of sinking during an ordeal if they're like thrown in the water. The average lean woman has a 40% chance of sinking. So if cold water ordeals were used for men, they could exonerate those who underwent them. So they couldn't manipulate the cold water ordeals like once they tossed the person in the water, but by choosing who they sent to those ordeals, they could manipulate what the outcome was going to be. So here's some records from ordeals that have survived. So one was from Eastern Europe, I think like Romania or Ukraine. From 1208 to 1235, there were 208 cases of ordeals where they were used, and 130 probans were declared innocent. So, as the paper says, unless 2/3 of priests didn't understand how to heat iron, this suggests that there was rigging involved. Now, the priests were purposely not making the water boil, the big pot boil, because obviously if you stick your hand in boiling water, you're going to get damaged. You're going to be hurt by that. Now, in the English royal courts from 1194 to 1219 AD, out of the 19 individuals who underwent ordeals, 17 passed. Again, it should be pretty simple to understand how to boil water, but this wasn't the case. And then finally, in the English Eyre Rolls, there were 84 men and 7 women who underwent ordeals in this time. 79 men were sent to cold water ordeals, where they're very likely to pass. All 7 women who are likely to fail that, they were sent to the hot water ordeals. And there were 3 interesting cases which really help show this point. 3 cases where a man and a woman were either jointly accused of a crime, like committing it together, or like one was accused and then they were declared innocent and the other was accused. In all 3 of those cases, the men were sent to cold water ordeals while the women were sent to hot water ordeals, where the women could be let off and the men could be let off much easier. Now, the demise of ordeals also shows us, illuminates this theory. It requires the faith in the Iudicia Dei. If people don't believe it's the will of God, if they believe they're guilty, but they can still stick their arm in that boiling water and they're not going to get hurt, then they're going to undergo the ordeal to try to prove that they're not guilty, even though they are guilty. As the faith in this began to wane, they stopped using it. So another note is that Jews who were accused of crimes in these European cities were not allowed to undergo ordeals. In those cases, they required witnesses. People had to swear about what happened. But because they didn't believe in Iudicia Dei, they were not allowed to undergo these ordeals. Finally, in AD 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council banned ordeals. All the bishops and cardinals of the church got together and said that this goes against the Bible, this goes against Catholic teaching. We're not going to allow this to be done anymore. And within 5 years, most of Europe banned the use of ordeals. Without the superstition being tied to it, it became worthless. Another note is that trial by combat was also banned by the Fourth Lateran Council. In Norman England, this persisted until the 1700s. You could, if someone accused you of a crime, you could fight them. And it actually developed in a very complex practice where you could also hire someone to fight for you to settle these legal cases. This did not require a belief in Iudicia Dei. There was no religious superstition attached to it. It was just a way for basically Vikings to solve problems. This continued in Norman England for several centuries after the Fourth Lateran Council because there was no religious thing tied to it. So even though ordeals seem very odd, very primitive, that someone sticking their hand in something dangerous is going to show their innocence because God's going to swoop down and save them and help them. This was a response to not being able to solve crimes. They didn't really have police forces like we have today. They had no way to use physical evidence So if someone didn't see a crime go down, there was really no way to solve it. So this was a way to try to get guilty people to confess and innocent people to show their innocence. And we still do have contemporary examples of superstitions like this. My favorite one is the polygraph. There's no way to physiologically measure the truthfulness of a person. Like, you cannot tell how truthful a person is being through like the signs, I don't know, by measuring stuff on the body. But if people believe that polygraphs work, that it is able to show that they're like being truthful or being dishonest, they will be willing to undergo it to signify their innocence. If you're innocent and you think that a polygraph is going to work, you'll obviously take the polygraph test to show that the results are going to be that I'm innocent. If you're guilty and you think it's going to show that you're guilty, you're not going to undergo it. Because obviously you're going to have a scientific record that you're lying. Polygraphs are still able to be used because most people believe that polygraphs work. And usually when you get when you receive a polygraph test, like the first question they ask you is like, do you believe polygraphs work? A lot of most government agencies require you to get polygraph tested before you start, and that's one of the first questions they ask for that. They're using squiggly lines on a piece of paper rather than hot irons, but it's the same basic idea of separating the innocent from the guilty and encouraging the innocent to undergo this and convincing the guilty to not do it or to come out and say they're guilty. This obviously doesn't harm you like an ordeal does, so it's not really going to convince people that are guilty to say they're guilty in most cases, but it's still going to separate the innocent from the guilty. And a joke that Leeson, who does this for a living, just looks at weird superstitions. He said, superstitions like Jell-O, there's always room for more. Even when you think a society is advanced, they still have superstitions that help guide people's actions. Real quick, I'm going to do the longbow before we start, before we move on. So the question is, why did Francis Scotland refuse to adopt the longbow, this very cheap military technology, when Britain used it to destroy their armies for 150 years? This is an example of one battle. I forget the name of the battle. 8,000 English soldiers suffered 14 casualties, defeating 15,000 Scots. If an army has double the troops of you back in this day, you were normally defeated very easily. Instead, they hardly lost any troops. The longbow was superior to the crossbow, which was the alternate technology, and it was just as cheap. If we're looking at this, the Imagine Perfect competition, there's the first mover advantage that we get, the new whatever innovation they have. It's rapidly competed away by new entrants adopting the technology. I think the example we talked about was apps in the iPhone App Store. That's because it was cheap to do. All these other ones came out with apps, these other companies. Military technology is the same thing. Once one country comes out and adopts this new technology, very rapidly other countries begin to use that technology. But this was not the case for the longbow. It's just a clip from Braveheart where all the British soldiers are lined up and they pull the arrows and they're shooting at Mel Gibson and his band of Scottish soldiers, and it decimates them. So let's look at some of the features of the longbow. The longbow required a large number of archers to be effective. If you just had a couple dozen, you couldn't really aim it. So they had to have a whole group standing and just shooting at the whole other army. So having individuals who privately wanted to practice the longbow wasn't enough to develop an army, because it took a long time to be able to practice this, because the longbows are huge, so be able to get it aimed right is very difficult to have the strength, and then you got to pull back this huge string to get it to, rope, whatever, to get it to shoot. So basically the ruler had to create a culture of longbow usage. So what they did in Britain, they used a combination of state-sponsored tournaments. They gave financial incentives, you're paying people, giving them the free longbows and paying them to practice. And they had laws supporting longbow usage or requiring it during fairs and festivals. Longbow was cheap and easy to make, so a large number of citizens using a longbow could be a large potential army, and it was easy to equip themselves. So the adoption of longbow meant a well-armed populace. So some noble who was trying to usurp and take the crown or a popular uprising could remove the king by force very easily. And because the longbow made their army effective, they could have a smaller force than what the king had and still defeat his army. This is just a list of all the major battles between the English and the Scots and the French. They were typically outnumbered by at least 2-1, if not more, yet they still won almost all these battles because they had longbows and the French and the Scottish did not. So in your standard neoclassical model, a production function embodies the best available technology, and then given a set of prices, the producers are going to arrive at a cost function that achieves a given level of output at the minimum cost. So the producers who do not use technologically superior production methods, things that are able to reduce their costs the most efficiently, they're going to experience loss and they're going to be driven from their industries. Basically, the market process we talked about earlier, how loss forces firms to try to minimize their costs and use the best possible technology to arrive at that. In the case of military technology, such cost minimizing pressures are typically felt very quickly, leading to widespread and rapid adoption of superior technology. And if you look back at the wars throughout history, when one country comes out with an automatic weapon, all the countries they're facing that war come out with automatic weapons too, at almost exactly the same time. The adoption is very quickly because they have to. It's literally life or death. But the problems of the longbow, why we didn't see that, is that it required a centralized effort to create a culture of archery. And this wasn't present in people, and it was difficult for people. Well, it was a costly thing to do. It took a long time to train archers and develop skills. So you couldn't just raise an army and teach them to use the longbow real quick before you went to fight. And once you trained the army, a usurper could easily provide the cheap weapons to the subjects in order to lead a revolt and overthrow the king. So it dominates battle with a foreign enemy. So when Britain's fighting France or Scotland, they can win these battles easily, but it weakens the ruler's domestic position. I forget what example Flanders was going to be there. So I don't want to give you guys the wrong information. So the predictions we have for the usage of the longbow is that political stability is required for the adoption of the longbow. In France, they had chronic internal dissension throughout the Middle Ages. Their territory constantly expanded and receded. The king would go from having a very small territory to a large one encompassing most of France, and then would lose much of it quickly. The noble lords retained almost absolute power over their fiefdoms, so their individual areas, they had complete control. The king had nominal control at most. There was very little allegiance they gave to the king. And much of France was actually English areas. So the King of England was actually the vassal lord of certain areas. There were several different principalities that they were the lord over, but they were under the French king. In Scotland, they were very clannish, and there were a lot of warring factions within the country. You had different groups from Gaelic-speaking tribes in the north to English speakers down in the Midlands. At one point, in an event that was called the Great Cause, there were 13 claimants to the Scottish throne, and they all, you can guess, fought amongst themselves in order to try to get power. So with politically unstable conditions in France and Scotland, it would have been like suicide to adopt a longbow. If the king would have decided that to train a lot of people in their country to use the longbow, they would have just turned and overthrown the king. And the French king even admitted that in the 12 or 1300s. In England, the Magna Carta was signed in 1225. This was after 100 years of internal struggle and rebellions. There was finally some stability. So beginning with Edward I, you've seen Braveheart, that's the Longshanks, who they talk about, and ending with Henry IV, there was basically 150 years of political stability. And this coincides with their adoption of the longbow. So when England had some internal conflict, the longbow promotion was reduced. So late in Richard II's reign, there was some struggle between him and a few other nobles. So he stopped promoting the longbow. Removed laws requiring people to practice it and like go to fairs on holidays, and it was like every weekend, every like Saturday or Sunday they were required to do something. Got rid of those laws and some other like subsidies encouraging it, but they still had a population that was trained in it, so you couldn't completely like erode their human capital immediately. And then in the English-held lands in France, they didn't train their subjects in the use of the longbow because they didn't have a very good grasp on that French territory. All right. I don't know if we have a lot of time, so I'll just give you a super overview of this. This was a paper written by R.A. Radford, who spent half of World War II in a Nazi prison camp. He basically described how market institutions developed in these prisoner of war camps. They were given a bunch of rations by, I don't know if I have it in here, by I think the Red Cross. Yeah, by the Red Cross. And they began trading. Over time, prices developed. Cigarettes became the currency, and everything. The prices were literally marked in prices of cigarettes. How many cigarettes it would take to trade for it. Originally people like just donate stuff. They said, "Oh, here, I don't smoke. I don't want cigarettes. Take them." But like very soon after that, they began trading them. And what was it? Oh yeah, the resources were given by the Red Cross. They weren't produced by the individuals in there. So this is and he even mentions in the paper, this is irreconcilable with the labor theory of value, because the amount of labor that went into it in these POW camps was zero. These people were just giving it to it freely. Rather than any sort of like exploitation going on, the prices developed through just the relative value for individuals trading them. There's entrepreneurs existed. They actually built up like a coffee shop and a restaurant, but then after Allied bombing like destroyed the camp and reduced the rations, those failed. There's excess profits for people that were originally able to trade with Hindus, because very few people could speak the language. But over time, once more people were able to learn the language and trading became more common, they competed down those excess profits, like all the way down to zero. So basically, Radford shows how these economic theories that we talked about, how they actually played out in real time and how they developed. Okay, so with that, we don't have a ton of time. We've got like 20 minutes to go over the review. Do you guys have any questions of like what's going to be on the exam, what the exam's going to be like, things like before I start out and talking about the individual questions? Okay, so this on the review sheet. There's a couple questions from like the first couple exams, mostly the first exam, just like some basic stuff about economics, like are people rational, like what is opportunity cost, simple stuff like that. But then should be under the study guide section on Canvas. Yeah, study guide final exam. So for oligopoly, that's primarily going to be your multiple choice questions. We didn't go too in depth on oligopoly, and there's no supply and demand graphs used to understand the market because it's really difficult to draw a demand curve for an oligopolist because there's only a couple other firms, and what they do depends entirely on what their competition does. So unlike a lot of this stuff is just definitions, like what are the characteristics of an oligopoly market? There's a few firms, and there's barriers to entry. All right, like how is oligopoly different from perfect competition? Obviously, the three assumptions of perfect competition: the many firms, no barriers to entry, and the same product.
What was the last one?
The same product. So here, oligopoly, there are barriers to entry, and there's only a few firms. And the products they sell could be the same, it could be different. They can be or they can be the same.
Wait, the limiting characteristics for what?
Perfect competition. Okay, so in what types of markets do you find differentiation of products? Anyone? What was that? And what types of markets do we see product differentiation? So we get in monopolistic competition, and we can also get in oligopoly. They list breakfast cereal in the textbook as like an example of oligopoly, because there are only a couple firms. But you do see differentiation in the products you buy. You can buy like the boring Raisin Bran, or you can get like, I don't know, Lucky Charms or something. That's all sugary. There's some variety there. Okay. So what's the 4-firm concentration ratio? That's just the number of sales by the top 4 firms in an industry. That's a way that that economists tend to use to try to describe the competitiveness of an industry. If you've been in the office, when someone asks Michael when he's presenting to Ryan's business class what his Herfindahl index is, and he thinks it's like a joke, it's the 4-firm concentration ratio.
What is the drawback?
The drawbacks. Okay, so they list like the top 4 firms that it's like in the country. Obviously, firms from other countries can compete in the market. And if they define the industry too narrowly, they're like missing out on competitors. You might say like the NFL has a monopoly on football, but on a Sunday afternoon, you might want to do other things for entertainment. You might want to watch a movie. You might want to watch pro bowling. Some people watch pro bowling, I'm sure. Okay, so why are oligopolies difficult to study using supply and demand curves?
Other question. What's an example of an oligopoly industry?
So it's anything where there's only going to be a couple firms and barriers to entry. So auto industry is like the most common one. Textbook says like discount department stores, pharmacies and drugstores, aircraft, computers, cigarettes. Only a couple cigarette companies left.
Why? Oh,
Yeah. So you're looking for where there's going to be like 3-4 firms that are basically competing, and that is really difficult to get into. Like it's tough to get into the auto industry because there's huge fixed costs to like build giant plants to like get in. So yeah, one of these questions, give an example of barrier to entry for oligopoly. So one is high fixed cost. There's like economies of scale. That the more you produce, the cheaper it is to produce. So the large, already established firms are going to have an easier time. Ownership of key input. It's basically the same as monopoly, but this is spread out between a couple firms. Yeah, that didn't make any sense. I was trying to figure out what I meant there. I think I just switched the sentence around. I didn't delete part of it. Okay. So why is there more competition among restaurants than among large discount department stores? So imagine like Walmart, Target, those. Anyone have an answer for that? This is one of those questions that's a little bit more opinion using economics than like an answer that's going to be written in the textbook.
Is it because like restaurants can make their food better or worse, but the department store just has like the same things just for different prices?
Yeah. So like a department store, like they're selling a ton of different goods, but they sell basically the same. You go, you get your kitchen stuff, your junk, some cheap clothes. It's all the same sorts of things. So it's difficult for them to differentiate themselves. Whereas for restaurants, you can sell any different like type of ethnic food. You can sell super cheap, super big portions. You can have live music all the time, craft beer. Like there's tons of different ways to try to I don't know, show off, to differentiate and get new consumers in there. And why do you guys think that fast casual restaurant chains are monopolistic competition rather than perfect competition? So fast casual is things a little bit classier than fast food, more like Chipotle than like in Subway.
Because like barriers to entry, it would be tough for like a new firm to enter the market. Or
You think it'd be difficult to get in the restaurant market?
for a fast casual restaurant, talking like fast food chains.
Not fast food, like the little bit step up from them, like Chipotle or.
Brand name?
Yeah, they're able to differentiate like based off brand name. That's a way that they can differentiate. But basically, like why is there more competition among restaurants? Like the same kind of thing that they're able to differentiate themselves.
Can you go back to the question about this, the top of page?
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Yeah. So because there's only a couple firms, and how a firm reacts depends on what their competitors are doing.
what question is this?
The top question on here. Because they have to, what they choose to do depends on what their competition does. It's difficult. You can't draw like a demand curve for that. So like if you go through chapter 14 in the book, like there's no supply and demand graphs. There's no, I don't know, or marginal revenue crosses marginal cost.
So why do they exist?
Why does what exist? The industry?
All companies?
Because there's a small number. Oh, you mean the question. I thought you were asking like why we're even talking about this. So they exist because there's barriers to entry. There's some sort of barriers to entry preventing more firms from competing.
Okay, so, fast casual restaurant chains are, it's because they can differentiate themselves,
Yeah.
that's all?
Can you think of something else? I mean, that's like the main difference between monopolistic competition and perfect competition, is that you have a differentiation of products. Okay, so the key characteristics of monopolistic competition for one of those markets is barriers to entry are low. There's many firms, but they compete selling slightly different products. So it's basically the same as perfect competition, but there's differentiation.
Wait, can you say that again?
What, the three or what I just said? Okay, so the three are, there are many firms, low barriers to entry, and differentiated but similar products. Now, firms in the monopolist competition market, they are price makers. They have some market power, so they're able to set prices where they choose. Now because it's a downward sloping demand curve, if they sell at a higher price, they're going to sell fewer units, but they're still able to choose where they want to sell along the demand curve. Whereas remember, perfect competition, if they try to sell at a higher price, no one's going to buy from them at all. In this market, they do have some sort of power to set prices. All right, someone want to give me an example of a monopolistically competitive market?
I did my assignment on video streaming services. And, one of the biggest reasons they're monopolistically competitive is because they have similar products, but the different types of shows and different if they have original shows and stuff like that sets them apart enough to where they can be different enough so they can set their price and things like that and make themselves competitive with one another.
Yeah, so Disney Plus is different enough from Hulu. Obviously, I keep going back to restaurants. That's the easiest example to see how they're able to differentiate themselves, but it's still similar to products. All right, if a firm faces downward sloping demand curve, how can it sell more units? Someone tell me that. It's not a trick question. Just lower the price. Okay, so next question is draw the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve for a firm in monopolistic competition. So what does the demand curve look like? Downward sloping. So something like that. What's the marginal revenue curve going to look like?
Steeper downward rate.
Yeah. So it's going to be below the curve at all points and down more steeply. Probably should have drawn a little bit steeper. But yeah, your marginal revenue is going to fall faster than your demand curve. All right, and where do firms in monopolistic competition maximize their profits? No, I mean like on the graph, at what point? The same as perfect competition.
Marginal cost,
Equals,
marginal revenue.
yes. So this is going to be a question that's later. Here's your marginal cost curve. So you're going to produce the quantity where these two cross. But now the price you're going to sell at is going to be where this hits the demand curve. So you produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But then the price you sell at is where, is straight up from there on the demand curve.
Because that's how much people are willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
You produce that and sell that.
You what? Okay, so let's ask what the marginal revenue of the third unit is. So you're going from 14 to 19.5, $19.50. So the difference is $5.50. That's the marginal revenue. The additional revenue you get from the third unit. Okay, so what are some other ways in which firms compete other than just on price in a monopolistic competition?
Like their products, they try to make more advanced, like products,
Like better products?
like make them faster, just stuff like that. Like
Yeah.
smartphones, like in the end, Apple and Samsung, they like both be joking that like they're just honestly trying to beat each other, so they're just trying to make a new phone that make it better than Samsung or something like that.
Yeah. Got a phone that doesn't break when you fold it in half? Hey, they tried. Yeah, so other than, they can compete on quality, they can try to meet specific consumer needs. So there might be, I don't know, needs that are unmet or wants that are unmet for consumers. If you ever run out of time. All right. Okay, so I've got like 2.5 pages left. It's 9:15. We can end now, and I will post a video